Dawn on June 7, 1944, revealed a victory in peril on Omaha Beach. The Allies had cracked Hitler's Atlantic Wall, but now faced a more insidious enemy: logistics. The beaches were a nightmarish bottleneck. Landing craft lay stranded on the sand at low tide, unable to offload. Trucks and bulldozers sank into the shifting shingle. The entire immense army ashore, its ammunition, fuel, and food, was supplied through a trickle of small craft vulnerable to weather and German artillery. As U.S. First Army reports warned, the offensive risked stalling before it began, just as the disastrous 1942 Dieppe Raid had proven an invasion needed a working port to survive. German commanders, reading the same terrain, believed the Allies would choke on their own supply lines. But they had missed the secret moving across the English Channel. Even as the first troops waded ashore, a colossal, prefabricated answer was being towed toward them in pieces. Codenamed Mulberry, it was the largest engineering project of its kind in history, constructed in total secrecy across the UK. This was not a plan to capture a port. It was a plan to bring one. When assembled off the Normandy coast, this artificial harbor, a maze of colossal concrete caissons, floating steel roadways, and sunken breakwaters, would allow deep-draft Liberty ships and tankers to dock and unload directly, bypassing the deadly beaches entirely. In the following critical months, this lunatic's dream, as critics called it, would become the lifeline of the Western Front. Over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies would flow through these concrete miracles, sustaining the entire Allied campaign. The idea of towing a harbor across the storm-tossed channel seemed like folly. But it was the folly that won the war. How did the Allies build two massive, secret harbors in under a year? And what did this impossible feat reveal about the war-winning power of Allied industry and imagination? The German High Command viewed the coming invasion through a lens of cold logistical arithmetic. Their Fortress Europe strategy, as outlined in OB West directives, was not just about repelling an initial assault, but about strangling it. They concentrated their finest troops and most formidable fortifications around the deep-water ports of northern France, Calais, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Brest. Their logic, reinforced by the bloody Allied failure at Dieppe in 1942, was ironclad. Any successful invasion army would need to capture a major port intact and immediately to offload the thousands of tons of supplies, heavy vehicles, and ammunition required daily to sustain an offensive. Without it, the beachhead would wither. German intelligence calculated the numbers. To support the dozens of divisions needed to break out of Normandy, the Allies would require a minimum of 12,000 to 15,000 tons of material every single day. To the German mind, delivering this volume across the open, storm-racked beaches of the English Channel, under constant fire from coastal artillery and air attack, was a physical impossibility. The combination of their own beach obstacles, murderous enfilading fire from fortified strong points, Widerstandsnisten, and the channel's famously treacherous weather created what they believed was an impassable funnel. Any forces that landed would be funneled into a kill zone of scarcity and bombardment. Propaganda boasted of an impregnable Atlantic wall, but the real German confidence lay in this deeper, logistical certainty. The idea of constructing an entire harbor and towing it across the sea was beyond military planning. It was an absurdity, a fantasy dismissed by the rigid geographic logic of their general staff. This was the peak of documented German confidence, rooted in what they saw as immutable facts of geography and supply. They were fortifying the map as it existed, believing the Allies were bound by the same constraints. They were preparing for a battle of ports, a fight over the fixed nodes on their coastline. While German generals poured concrete into gun emplacements, a very different kind of construction was underway in the flooded quarries and hidden shipyards of Britain. Declassified War Office minutes from 1943 reveal a project so audacious it was initially dismissed as science fiction. The Allied plan for D-Day was haunted by the ghosts of Dieppe. The 1942 raid on the French port had been a slaughter, and its official postmortem delivered two brutal lessons. A frontal assault on a fortified harbor was suicide, and men and machines piled on an open beach were nothing but targets. A new way to supply an invasion army had to be invented, or Overlord would share Dieppe's fate. The geography of Normandy presented a second, equally daunting enemy: the tide. On beaches like Omaha, the water retreated over 20 feet vertically, stranding landing craft hundreds of yards from the shore on a vast, exposed killing ground at low tide. At high tide, deadly German obstacles were submerged. This meant efficient unloading was possible for only brief, predictable windows each day, windows that German gunners could zero in on. It was a tidal trap. The scale of the requirement made the problem apocalyptic. To break out of Normandy, the Allies needed to land the equivalent of a major industrial city on a hostile shore. The official logistical plans called for moving over 150,000 men, 20,000 vehicles, and 25,000 tons of supplies across the channel every single day in the crucial build-up phase. Doing this over open beaches, vulnerable to the channel's ferocious weather and the Luftwaffe, was a recipe for strategic paralysis. The stakes were absolute. Failure to solve this meant the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled would wither and die on the Normandy coast. Its armies starved of the bullets and fuel needed to fight. The entire war in the West hinged on an unsolved equation of logistics. This was the documented Allied nightmare. A recent, traumatic failure combined with a looming logistical cliff that threatened to undo the entire campaign before it began. They needed a revolution in military engineering. The answer came not from a soldier, but from a civil engineer. And the blueprint, found in Churchill's personal files, was for something never before attempted: a floating pier that could be built in Britain and sunk into place off the coast of France. The solution was born from a stroke of defiant imagination. In May 1942, haunted by Dieppe, Winston Churchill issued a historic memo: "Piers for use on beaches, they must float up and down with the tide. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves." From this order, a team of brilliant, unorthodox engineers, including civil engineer Bruce White and scientist J.D. Bernal, conjured up Mulberry. Their plan: prefabricate an entire harbor in Britain and sail it to France. The design was a kit of parts for a port, each component a marvel of emergency engineering. The Phoenix caissons were the walls. Colossal concrete boxes, some 200 feet long and 6 stories tall, built in flooded quarries and dry docks, then sealed and floated. The whale piers were the roads. 80-foot-long floating steel roadway spans that would flex with the waves, connecting to the shore on flexible spud pierheads. To create calm water, there were Bombardier floating steel breakwaters, and the Gooseberries, a fleet of 60 obsolete merchant ships and warships to be sunk as an initial sacrificial breakwater. The industrial mobilization was Herculean and clandestine. Over 45,000 workers, shipwrights, concrete pourers, steelworkers, labored across 70 dispersed sites, from the Thames estuary to remote Scottish lochs, often unaware they were building pieces of the same gigantic puzzle. It consumed 600,000 tons of concrete, 100,000 tons of steel, and covered 1.5 million square feet with temporary workshops. This was prefabrication and modular construction on an unprecedented warlike scale. As one project manager noted, it was a floating circus of parts, each piece a testament to Allied industrial muscle and organizational genius, all hidden in plain sight under a blanket of supreme secrecy. This documented explosion of Allied industrial creativity and centralized mobilization stood in stark contrast to the German focus on pouring concrete into static, defensive emplacements. The Allies were building the ultimate offensive tool, a logistics system that could move. As D-Day approached, the components, a bizarre, gigantic flotilla of concrete boxes and steel roadways, were assembled in secret anchorages along England's south coast. German aerial reconnaissance photos from May 1944, later analyzed, show these strange structures, but their purpose remained a mystery. On D+1, as the battle for the beachhead raged, an even more audacious operation began: the Great Tow. From hidden anchorages along England's coast, a motley fleet of over 150 tugs, from ocean-going giants to Thames River barges, strained at their lines. Their cargo was the Mulberry Circus, monstrous Phoenix caissons, long trains of floating whale roadway, and odd-looking Bombardier breakwaters. Their destination was the Normandy coast, 100 miles of open, hostile water away. The journey was a nightmare of vulnerability. The convoys crawled at a mere 1 to 4 knots. The Phoenix units, vast concrete boxes weighing thousands of tons, wallowed in the swell, threatening to swamp their tugs or break their tow lines in the poor post-invasion weather. This slow, sprawling armada was the single most valuable target in the English Channel, a chance for the Luftwaffe and German E-boats to cripple the Allied invasion at its logistical heart. Its survival hinged entirely on the hard-won supremacy of Allied air and naval power. Spitfires and Mustangs prowled overhead, while destroyers and corvettes circled, driving off the few, desperate attacks that German forces could muster. The first critical task upon arrival was creating a foothold of calm water. At Omaha and Gold Beaches, crews began scuttling the Gooseberry blockships, old freighters and warships, deliberately sinking them in precise lines to form initial breakwaters. Only within this minimal shelter could the intricate assembly begin. The pressure was immense. Ashore, the fighting armies were consuming their initial D-Day supplies at a ferocious rate. The entire campaign now depended on the success of this bizarre seaborne caravan and the engineers waiting to receive it. It was a race against a ticking clock and the ever-present threat of a channel storm that could scatter the precious components to the winds. Against the odds, the circus arrived. And then, as Royal Engineers' diaries recount, the even more difficult task began. Assembling the world's largest mechanical puzzle under occasional enemy fire and the constant threat of the sea. The assembly off the Normandy coast was an engineering ballet performed under duress. Royal Engineers and Seabees, working around the clock, opened the seacocks on the Phoenix caissons, sinking them in precise lines to form the massive breakwater walls. They connected the floating whale roadways to the spud pierheads anchored to the seabed, creating skeletal fingers that reached out into the channel. Within days, the outlines of 2 full-scale harbors emerged from the chaos. Mulberry A at Omaha and Mulberry B at Arromanches began accepting their first deep-draft ships, a trickle of salvation for the supply-starved armies ashore. Then nature declared war. On June 19th, a generational storm, a great gale, swept into the channel. For 4 brutal days, winds of near-hurricane force and massive waves pounded the coast. The unfinished harbors faced their ultimate test. Mulberry A, exposed at Omaha Beach and not fully secured, was shattered. Waves over 8 feet high smashed the floating roadways and breached the concrete walls of the Phoenix caissons. As the U.S. Army's logistical history records, it was a catastrophe. 21 of its 28 Phoenix units were destroyed or sunk, rendering the harbor useless. The American supply effort had to be rerouted through the surviving British Mulberry and the Beaches, creating a critical emergency. But at Arromanches, Mulberry B, though severely damaged, held. Its position in a slightly deeper, more sheltered bay and marginally better initial anchoring made the difference. The storm revealed fatal flaws. Components broke loose, connections failed, but the core structure survived. This was the decisive moment. In the storm's aftermath, faced with the total loss of one harbor and a damaged other, the Allies didn't retreat. They redoubled. A frantic, Herculean repair operation descended on Arromanches. Engineers reinforced anchors, salvaged and replaced broken spans, and patched the wounded Phoenix units, learning and adapting from the storm's fury. What emerged was no longer a prototype. It was Port Winston, a hardened, resilient lifeline. This was a battle on 2 fronts, against the ocean's raw power and against time itself. The documented Allied response, a display of breathtaking engineering adaptability and sheer will, stood in stark contrast to the verified, temporary triumph of natural forces. The storm had won a battle destroying Mulberry A, but it lost the war for the beachhead because the Allies refused to let their one remaining miracle die. They rebuilt it stronger. With the storm past, Port Winston at Arromanches began its historic work. The daily logs of the harbor master record a staggering, relentless flow of material that turned the tide of the war. Once repaired, Port Winston at Arromanches became an industrial-scale spigot, pouring the Allied war machine into France. Its daily logs record a staggering, relentless output. At its peak, It discharged up to 12,000 tons of stores and 2,500 vehicles every 24 hours. In total, before it was finally retired in November 1944, this single artificial harbor delivered the decisive mass of the invasion. Over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. These were not abstract numbers. They were the tanks for Operation Cobra, the ammunition for the Falaise Gap, and the fuel for the race to the Seine. Strategically, Mulberry B won the critical build-up battle of Normandy. It allowed the Allies to concentrate forces and material in the bridgehead faster than the Germans could reinforce their defensive lines, directly enabling the breakout and the devastating encirclement at the Falaise pocket. The German response was one of stunned despair. Captured intelligence reports reveal their officers could not comprehend the supply levels sustaining the Allied advance. The harbor at Arromanches, visible from the hills inland, stood as a daily, humiliating testament to an industrial and logistical might they could not match. While German divisions starved for fuel and shells, the Allies operated from a position of overwhelming abundance, a direct result of the concrete harbor they had towed across the sea. Today, rusting phoenix caissons and skeletal piers still rest in the sands at Arromanches, a permanent monument to the effort. They are the physical legacy of the unbreakable lifeline. This documented torrent of Allied logistical power, enabled by the Mulberry, created the stark, war-winning contrast with the verified German logistical starvation that crippled their mobility and combat power in the West. The immediate victory was the sustenance of the Normandy campaign. But when post-war analysts studied Mulberry, they realized its true legacy was not just in concrete and steel, but in a new philosophy of warfare. The Mulberry Harbor did more than win a battle. It revolutionized warfare and engineering. Doctrinally, it proved that a major amphibious assault could be logistically self-sufficient. This lesson was etched into the DNA of Western military planning. From the improvisation of the tactical floating dock at Incheon in 1950 to the sophisticated offshore logistics of the Falklands War in 1982, the ghost of Mulberry guided the principle. Bring your own port or control your own means of supply. The project's engineering legacy was equally profound. It was a staggering demonstration of systems engineering, prefabrication, and project management under extreme pressure. The techniques of assembling massive, functional structures in a hostile marine environment directly influenced the construction of offshore oil platforms and remote scientific bases, like the U.S. McMurdo Station in Antarctica. It showed the world that with sufficient will and coordination, the most permanent-looking civil engineering feats could be made temporary, mobile, and deployable. Culturally, Mulberry became the ultimate symbol of Allied, can-do ingenuity. Its story is a centerpiece of D-Day museums, not just as a clever tool, but as a testament to the industrial and intellectual mobilization that characterized the Allied war effort. It represented a mindset that looked at the English Channel not as an impassable barrier, but as a problem to be solved with concrete, steel, and nerve. This documented leap in expeditionary warfare capability and civil engineering philosophy stands in permanent contrast to the verified German defensive mindset. The Germans perfected the art of fortifying fixed points. The Allies mastered the art of making their own points, anywhere they needed them. Mulberry was the ultimate expression of offensive logistics. Historians of technology and warfare now see Mulberry not as a mere harbor, but as the ultimate embodiment of a war-winning principle, the ability to project and sustain overwhelming force across any obstacle. The Mulberry Harbor stands as one of the most profound symbols of 20th century warfare. It crystallizes a fundamental truth of World War II. The conflict was won as much in the shipyards and drafting rooms of the Allied homelands as on the battlefields. Mulberry was the physical, floating manifestation of the logistics war, a factory-built bridge that connected the immense industrial output of the United States and the United Kingdom directly to the foxholes of Normandy. It turned the English Channel from a defensive moat for Fortress Europe into a secure Allied supply route. It is also a permanent monument to the power of Allied cooperation. A British concept developed with British engineering genius was built with shared resources and deployed to support an American-led army group on a French beach. Its success required seamless coordination between navies, armies, engineers, and merchant marines of multiple nations, a bureaucratic and operational achievement almost as impressive as the engineering itself. Historians have long debated the what-ifs of D-Day, and on this there is strong consensus. Without the Mulberries, the Normandy campaign risked catastrophic failure. A major storm, or even sustained bad weather, could have strangled the invasion on its beaches long before Cherbourg was captured. As historian Rick Atkinson concluded, the harbors provided the margin of victory in the great logistical battle. They were the ultimate insurance policy for overlord, the concrete and steel guarantee that the Allied army would not just land, but would be nourished and reinforced unstoppably. They shifted the campaign from a desperate gamble into a war of attrition that the Germans, with their fractured logistics and crippled industry, could not hope to win. The legacy is one of systemic, industrial-scale problem-solving. The Allies didn't just fight the German army. They engineered around the problem of the Atlantic coast. This documented triumph of long-range planning and material abundance stands in stark contrast to the verified German reliance on tactical brilliance and fixed defensive points, a philosophy that proved brittle when faced with an enemy that could literally reshape the battlefield. So, what is the ultimate, concrete lesson from this story of harbors born from disaster? The ultimate lesson of the Mulberry Harbors is this: victory goes to those who solve the second problem first. The first problem was the D-Day landings themselves, a monumental challenge. But the second, more critical problem was staying there, fed and armed. The Allies invested their ingenuity, industry, and sheer will into solving that logistical nightmare before the first landing craft hit the sand. That foresight, more than any single battle, won the campaign in the West. They laughed because they couldn't conceive of bringing a harbor with you. The Allies didn't just imagine it. They built two, towed them across the stormy English Channel, and made them work under gunfire and a historic gale. It was the definitive triumph of long-term industrial planning and adaptability over short-term, static thinking. This story is a testament to the unsung heroes, the engineers, the welders, the designers, the tugboat captains, whose anonymous, brilliant work in the shadows built the foundation for the glory won on the front lines. The final, concrete measure of their success is recorded in the Harbor Master's Log. Between June 19th and October 31st, 1944, Mulberry B discharged a daily average of 6,750 tons of supplies, peaking at 12,000 tons. It was the indispensable artery of the Allied liberation of Europe. This story is anchored in engineering reports and harbor logs. If you want to discover more incredible true stories of the unsung engineering that won World War II, subscribe. We build the story from the blueprints up. Next time, we'll reveal another hidden wonder: the pipeline under the ocean, Pluto. How the Allies laid fuel pipelines from England to France to keep Patton's tanks running is a story of secret engineering beneath the waves. History harbors a truth. The greatest victories are often built not on the battlefield, but in the quiet places where someone dares to solve the impossible problem long before the first shot is fired.